name is Maria Barnes, and I'm the chapter president of Access Lunchtime. Today we are going to have a guest speaker. That is Dale. Is Fye the correct way to pronounce your last name?
It is. Thank you.
And Dale also is the chapter president of the Eastern Time or Early Morning Access User Group. So you may have listened to him on that. And as well, he is the owner of Developing Solutions, LLC, which develops custom software and business intelligence solutions. He's a previous MVP and is going to demo for us today a linked table manager add-in that he has developed. And you may be familiar with the new linked table manager for Office 365 or have heard about it, but this can be used for other versions. It's an add-in that can be used for other versions. And it does operate a bit differently and perhaps has even added functionality. It's not quite as simple as that is at the moment. So Dale, take it away.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, so you should see my slideshow on your screen at this point, and I will introduce myself briefly. Maria already did a pretty good job of that, and so I will pretty much leave it at this. If you download the link table manager at some point and need to get a hold of me, my email there is dale@devsolution.com. And that's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Okay, so why do we need a new link table manager? The link table manager that you're looking at on screen right now is, I don't think it was ever replaced. I mean, I've got 2003 on my computer, and this is the one that's in use in 2003. I think it's the same one that was available in 2000, and it may be the same one that was available in Access 97. I don't know for sure, but it was one of the most complained about elements of Access that never seemed to get any traction. Microsoft just refused to do anything about it for years and years and years. Problems with this particular version were that it's not sizable. So like you can see, I've got tables there with paths that run off to the side, and I can scroll the scroll bar over, but when I do that, I lose the checkbox visibility of the checkboxes and the likes. It's not sortable, so it is sortable. It sorts by table name, but sometimes you want to group your tables together by the path, not the table name, or just the back end, not the table name. And there's no way to tell by looking at this whether or not you have a valid link or not. It's just you got a table name, it's there in your database, and you don't know whether it's works or not. But the most annoying thing, at least in my mind, was always the incessant file dialogues when you wanted to refresh links, and you selected a bunch of these, and they came from different data sources. If you selected them, every single table you would get prompted for with a new file dialog to select the path and the back-end database for that table. Very annoying. This particular database that you're seeing the link table manager on right now has like 75 tables from over 20 different data sources. So it became really annoying to try and either find the tables I wanted to refresh, just check those, and then do the relink, or that type of thing. So that's really why we needed a new linked table manager. I see somebody's having problems hearing me. Is everybody, or are we generally okay? Okay, I'll just keep going until somebody tells me to stop. So finally, actually, I started work on my link table manager about 2.5 years ago. I had some code that I've been using for a number of years, and I just started putting it into an application as opposed to having code stuck here and there that I would borrow and use over and over again. Eventually, Microsoft said on the user's voice agreed that they were going to update the link table manager. Didn't give us a real timeline for that update, so I said, well, let me go ahead and start working on my version of it. And I don't know about a year ago they came out with the new link table manager for Access. Looks generally like what you see on the screen now. It's a tree view type based structure with the data source listed as at the root level, and then the tables listed underneath. And you'll see that that's very similar to the way mine ended up looking as well, although it's not in a tree view structure. And then they've got a number of different options down the left-hand side that you can do actions on. So, like I said, I created the Developing Solutions LTM. It's easy to install. It does a analysis of all of the tables and pass-through query connection strings when you start the application. It identifies all the unique data sources, counts the numbers of tables or queries associated with each, identifies whether the data source, whether the connection string is valid or not, and then it displays all that information in a subform that lets you see the different data sources in one subform and then tables in a different one. So I thought that the subform methodology worked pretty well, and so that's the way I decided to use it. I've used tree views a lot in the past, and just decided I didn't feel comfortable going that route at the moment. So this is an example of what my LTM looks like when it's linked to one of my applications that's got this one I think is the one that had like 20 different data sources. You'll see that in the top here, we've got a data source type. It'll tell you whether it's access. It'll tell you whether it's getting the data from a pass-through query or not, and it will, or whether it's getting the data from an ODBC connection string. It gives you the file name. In this case, where the file is an ODBC connection, it actually gives you the database name, and that's actually the database. Oops, back up that. The database name here as well in the file name column. If you look at the path column, it gives you the path to the file, to the backend file, if it's an Access database, or it gives you the server name and the driver that's being used for that connection. And then if you click on one of the checkboxes, like I've done here with the FD data database, it opens up a window at the bottom of the screen that displays all of the tables that are linked to that. Oh, and over on the right-hand side, there's that column that tells you how many tables are linked with that data source. It has a number of options, and this is going to expand here as I move forward, because I've added some functionality recently that begs to be added to the options properties as well. But we've got options for select the default action on relink, and basically it's basically asking whether or not you want to do a relink or a refresh as the default. In my case, I very rarely refresh connections, so I have the default set for prompt for a new source, which means I want to relink it. The size data source columns to fit the subform is yes or no. If we go back and look at the previous screen, basically what that does is it takes the file name and path columns and sizes them appropriately based on the size of the form. The form is expandable. It is expandable. So as you resize the form, those two columns will resize themselves appropriately if you have that checked. And basically what they do is they take the width of the form minus the borders minus the width of the selected source and tables columns, and then they parse out the remainder of that at about a 60-40 ratio to resize those columns. If you don't have that checked, those two columns will stay the same size, and you'll just end up with a lot of white space on the right-hand side, or you'll end up pushing data off outside the boundary of the subform, and you'll have to use the scroll bar to see the stuff on the side. So going back over here, you can also define the number of rows to display in the data source and the table subforms. If you've got maybe you're working on a monitor that you've turned to vertical so that it's really tall, and you want to display a lot of rows, you can affect that. Or if you've got a widescreen monitor that doesn't have a whole lot of vertical capacity, you can limit the number of rows to display in both the data source section and in the table subform section as well. You can set the default driver for SQL Server. I've got mine set at native client 10, but you can set it to whatever you want, and it'll automatically fill that in when you go to do a ODBC connection. But you'll see that there's other alternatives there as well, and that are unique to this as opposed to the LTM that Microsoft put out. Display foreign name in the table list. Originally, I was not displaying the source table name. I was just displaying the linked table name. And one of my users said, "Hey, why don't we display the source table name as well?" So I added that in there and made it a yes/no thing, so that you could leave it, you could display it if you wanted to or not. The prompt for local name when duplicate occurs. The default when you link to a new table that already exists in your front end is Access automatically just appends an underscore and then a numeric value that increments automatically as you increase the number of instances of that table. But I wanted to make it so that you could actually change the name and make it something else without having to do that in the navigation pane at a later time. So if you check box, it'll pop up an option for you to rename that table during the relink operation or the linking operation. And then the other thing I found is that whenever I work with SQL Server, I inevitably drop the schema name from the table name, so that I don't end up with a DBO underscore and the table name. All I want to see is table X, table Y, table Z. But if you want to see the schema name in there as well, then you just uncheck that box, and whatever the schema is will perpetuate itself in the local table name as well. So the installation process for my add-in is really simple. You download the file from my website. It's a free download. There is a pop-up box that will appear about every 20 times you run the application that reminds you that it's freeware, but that I would appreciate a donation if you care to make one. You can just ignore that pop-up box, or you can donate, whichever the case may be. If you donate, then you won't see that box again. And you can obviously donate whatever you feel is appropriate. Once you've downloaded the file, you extract the add-in file, the AccessUserGroups file, and place it in the folder that you can get to with the app data Microsoft add-ins. That usually equates to C:/users/username/roaming, oh no, I'm sorry, /appdata/roaming/Microsoft/add-ins. But you don't have to type all that in. If you just type in the percent appdata %, it'll take you to the correct folder. And in some versions of Office installation, that ends up being slightly different than what I just, what the folder name I just told you. So it's easier just to use the app data prefix here, and that'll take you where you need to go. Once you place that file in the folder, all you have to do is double click it or open it. There's an auto execute macro in there which changes the file path in the UsysRegInfo table, which is what Access and Windows uses to recognize the registry values for the database. And once it's done that, then you can close Access, open up any other database, select the database tools, add-ins, add-in manager, and I'll kind of walk you through that here in a minute. And then select the LTM to install it. And once you've done that, you're ready to use it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up Access and bring that over here. Can you now see my Access screen? Can somebody give me a thumbs up? Okay, thanks, Maria. Okay, so I'm starting out with a blank database because I want to start adding tables to it. So as I said, you go to Database Tools, Add-ins, and Add-in Manager. And you'll see, that's interesting. Why didn't that show up? Let's try this again. Let's uninstall that, and then we'll install it and close it. And now when we come in here, you'll see the LTM listed here. And it starts out blank because there aren't any linked tables. To add a data source, we click on Add Data Source. And everything's popping up on my other screen, so you'll see me dragging it across to show you, to get you to see it. But select Access, pick the file. Oops, here we go. And once I've done that, it evaluates, it assesses and says, yep, this is a valid file. It's, I can find that file. If I check on the selected option, it then displays the tables that are listed in that. And you can, if you select these, it then changes your options over here. One of the things I forgot to mention though is because we don't currently have any tables in here. Normally when you select this, let me redo this. Normally when you select this, if you have tables already linked to your database, this link type will show linked, and it will display the tables that are already linked that are in your database. In this particular instance, since I don't have any linked, it will automatically show me the tables that are available in that data source. And in this case, I only want to bring in this one table chunk data. I link the tables. It gives me a little processing flag over there, which is very brief since we're only linking one table. And then it reassesses and it shows it there. And now you can see that table is here. It's got the same local table name as the source table name at the moment. So now I'm going to, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to close this. I'll refresh the navigation bar, and I'm going to change the table name over here to get rid of the prefix on this table, because I want to show you how that works with other tables here in a second. And now when I rerun the link table manager, it opens up, shows me that it's checked, and you'll see that the local name is chunk data as opposed to table chunk data, as is the original source name. All right, now let me. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to add a SQL Server data source. So I pull that up. When I click next, it automatically searches my my network to see what servers are available. In this case, I've only got one server available. It's my local one. It automatically selects the first one of the numbers of the servers that you have available and populates the database drop down with the names of the databases that are in that server, and fills in your default SQL Server driver. Now, I've got like 4 different versions of SQL Server installed on my computer, of the driver installed on my computer. So if I don't know which one I want to use, or if I want to use the most recent version, I can just start out with the ODBC 17 for SQL Server and check the alternates checkbox. And when I test it, what it will do is it loops through that list of SQL Server drivers till it finds one that will work for my instance. And what I should see here is, okay, it accepted SQL Server 17. And at this point I can do a test. But let's just go back to a native client and try one of those and see what happens. I don't have, well, there is no native client 14. I added it here for demonstration purposes. But if we test it now, what we're going to see is that the driver, it adjusted the driver and said, oh, you don't have 13 installed. You're going to have to use 11. And then it gives me the option to continue. I recently added a feature that allows me to save my connections. And this it just makes it a whole lot easier for me as a developer to not have to remember all the connection strings and all the paths and all that. So I can now save the connection strings and use those later. So similar to what we did before, I'll now uncheck that and check this one. It will. It's going to still bring up this SQL Server login form. It's an ODBC form that whenever you initiate an ODBC connection to SQL Server, it's going to bring this form up the first time you do it. So you have to select that, and then it's going to show me all those tables that are available. And what I wanted to show you was specifically, we've got this DBO chunk data table that's in the SQL Server that is also, a copy of it is in that Access database that I was using. So I'm just going to select a couple of those, and then I'm going to link those tables. And again, you'll see my little status bar over here real quick. And then you'll see it's going to ask whether I want to rename that or give it the default name, and I'm just going to say okay, give it the default name. So now I have 2 valid connections up here. If I click here, you'll see I've got chunk data 1. I've dropped the schema. I've dropped the DBO schema from these tables, so they show up like that. And if I close this and refresh the navigation pane window, you'll see I've got those tables all there. Now, let's see here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the link table manager again. And let's just say that I've been working with my Access front end, or I've been using the Access back end, and now I want to switch over to my SQL Server back end that mimics the Access front end, the Access back end. So in this case, I want to refresh this link to the chunk data table that's linked in Access, and I'm going to link that back to the original data source. So for the, I mean the ODBC data source. So I'm going to select the SQL Server over here, hit relink. It's going to ask me again for my connection information. In this case, I want the report server. I want to use native client 10. Test that. And once that shows that it's valid, then you can go to next. And now it's relinked it. And now you'll see that I've actually lost the data source for the access file because it's no longer a valid data source. If I do this, I mean, let me phrase that. It's not that it's not a valid data source, but it's no longer an access data source. And you'll see that I have two different versions of the SQL Server driver that I'm using. So maybe in this case, I would want to come down here and resolve this one again, and I do want to prompt it for the location again because I want to fix that driver and make it driver 11 and test it again and use next. And now you'll see that I'm down to having one data source, that SQL Server, my local SQL Server with the data source report server, and there's 4 tables that are linked in there. Let's see here, scroll down. Okay, so at this point in time, I guess another thing I would show you is that I'm gonna pause the recording of this for a moment, Maria, because I don't want one of my clients' data saved on perpetuity on this video, but we'll come back to that in a second. Resume recording. All right, so it's been a relatively quick 30 minutes. I'd like to open it up if anybody has any questions.
So I've unmuted myself. Feel free to either type questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask questions. I do have one question myself.
Sure.
Dale, and as you've been working on the top of the link table manager here, I see you selecting one source at a time. If you have more than one source, can you select them both and see all of the tables from both sources on the bottom section, or does it pretty well act like a master subform relationship where you have to click on one at a time to see the tables only for that source?
No, it will display multiple sources in the tables in the bottom, and when you do that, I mean, in this particular case, let's go back and add an access data source in here again. And we'll add this table in here now. Oops, don't want to select all. Okay, so if I check on both of those, you'll see all those tables. And if you do a select all now and do a relink or refresh links, it will start out with, it'll start out and ask you for the first data source. And if you give it a new data source, it will process all of the tables that are associated with that data source. And then it will go on to the second data source that you've got selected and process all the tables that are associated with that data source. The one thing that I didn't talk about, and I honestly haven't tested the new link table manager, so maybe you can provide some info, either Jim or Maria. Does that Link Table Manager also process pass-through queries? Because this does. I go out and I search the pass-through query connection strings, and if I've got a pass-through query that in my database, it'll show up here, and I think I actually show that in the. Let me drag this off here. I think I actually show that in the original. Yes, in the original slide here, you'll see that these pass-through queries, data sources, different data sources. If I had checked one of those, you would see those pass-through queries here, and you can update the connection string through the pass-through query through here as well. So if
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I'll attempt to find that out while we're looking at other things here. Jim, if you do know the answer, let me know. I can't recall trying that specifically, but I may have.
Well, and finding a database that that has pass-through queries may not be easy either. I mean, a lot of the times when I create a pass-through query, it'll be a temporary thing, and it's I instantiate it, I run the query, then I delete the query. So, but in a lot of the applications I've got, I do have pass-through queries, or even a lot of cases I'll have a pass-through query that's just two different queries, one that returns records, one that doesn't, and then I'll just change the SQL string as appropriate for that query to get what I'm looking for at a particular time.
So another question while we're waiting for an answer on that, and everyone else feel free to, like I said, either unmute yourself or ask more questions. But another question here George had in the conversation panel is whether or not you have resolved the problem with the store versions of Access.
Is that Hepworth?
Yes.
Yeah, George. Are you talking about if you're talking specifically about the issue with creating and installing add-ins? The answer to that is yes. It's been resolved, but it's not a pretty resolution. It's why when I was talking about the path for installation, I said that in some cases it won't be as simple as appdata/Microsoft/add-in. There is if you have a store-bought version of Access, and I still don't exactly understand what store-bought means. I guess there's a Windows store that you can buy stuff from. If you've got that version of Access installed, then basically you end up with a sandbox, and the path to that particular add-in is let me see if I can pull up anyway, I'll put it out on my website because I have not done that yet. I need to put a little blog post out there about how to look for that. But there is basically, instead of looking in the roaming folder, you look in the local folder, and then there's about 4 other subfolders you have to go through to find the Microsoft add-in folder for installing applications in the store-bought version of Access. There is a question here about, can you explain why some drivers would not work in some instances? Actually, it's not really an issue of whether the drivers work or not. It's the issue is whether or not you have the drivers installed. The standard driver that most everybody has is just the SQL Server driver. Just says SQL Server. The more recent ones that are available are SQL Server Native Client 10, 11, there's 13, 13.1, and now there's other ODBC drivers for SQL Server, and those start, I think, at 17, and there's a couple lower versions of those as well. So it really just is about what drivers you have installed. That's one of the issues that I have with a lot of my clients is Their IT departments don't like having to install drivers on the computers of large numbers of people. Um, so they just say, well, just stick with the native one that everybody has. Well, the problem with that is that the SQL Server driver doesn't recognize many of the newer data types that are available in SQL Server, the big integer and some of the others. And some of the date time data types that are in SQL Server are not recognized by the SQL Server driver as anything other than a string. So if you're using a SQL Server driver against a newer version of SQL, you either will not be able to take advantage of those new driver new data types, or you'll get stuck having to convert those string values into a date data type before you do anything with it. Let's see if there's any other questions out there. Different installer types. Jim, you asked about different installer types. Can you expand on that? Oh, sorry, not a question. Okay. Let's see. Different installer type. No, I'm assuming, Jim, that comment then it was about the difference between the store-bought version and the other versions of Office.
Yeah. So it's just a different installer type. You get the same version of Access, but the registry keys are different.
Right. Yeah, and that's why the path to is not as simple as the app data, Microsoft add-ins. It ends up being username, local, and then there's like 4 or 5 separate subfolders that you have to go to find the folder to actually install it in with the store-bought version of Access. So. Okay, so Maria's posts, was your comment about the drivers just a comment, or I guess you got a question mark there. So what I do is I usually just to make sure I generally make sure that I'm doing all my development in a environment that has the same drivers that my client has, which may mean that I have multiple virtual machines, one for each client in some instances, or if I'm developing on a client server, I make sure that I've got installed on the desktop that I'm using on that client the same drivers that they all have installed. But what I did find, we did do some testing for one client where we installed some newer drivers on my system. So when I get ready to deploy a new version of the app, I go back and run the link table manager. I link it instead of being linked to the development backend. I relink it to the production backend, and then I change the driver. In their case, back to SQL Server, because their IT department didn't want to change the drivers for over 300 computers to one of the newer drivers. They have a new head of IT, so maybe I can convince him to make that change for me. But at the moment, they're stuck using the standard SQL Server driver, which is, according to some testing that's been done by other MVPs, significantly slower in processing a lot of queries than the native client 11 or higher and or the ODBC's driver for SQL Server drivers. So I would encourage you to use the highest level driver you can, the most recent, most current driver you can in your applications, and it's all determined by how friendly your IT department is and whether or not they'll either install the drivers or allow you to install the drivers on all of the users' computers. Any other questions? Let me move forward here. Let me go back through the slide. I think I had another. Okay, some updates. I didn't show it, so let me pull this up real quick again. I meant to do this early on in the briefing and I missed it, so let me pull that up. So in addition to the options dialog, we've got this options dialog box here as well. I've also got a help button, which has a help form, and you can search by a variety of topics and get some help, or you can print out a document. It's about a 3-page document that gives you all the basics on what the various sections do and what you need to know. There's also options here for donate, which we talked about, check for updates, and register. And unfortunately, my check for updates and register code is not working as well as I would like. It only does what I want it to about 1 out of every 10 times. So I don't know whether it's an issue of the connection to my SQL data source on my ISP or what, but I've got to do some work on that. Otherwise, I'm just getting this message that I created when it has connection problems. So if we go back over here to other updates, so I'm gonna update that, work on fixing those issues. One of the things that one of the guys that I had do some testing for me say was that when you load the application in a database that has a lot of data sources or a lot of SQL Server data sources, it can take some time to actually do that initial data source validation, because first it identifies all of the different data sources, and then it goes out and looks to see if they're valid. So it creates an ADODB connection to the SQL Server, queries the server, and if it gets an error back, then it tells you it's not a valid connection. Otherwise, it tells you it is. But the timeouts on some of those are take a while, and one of the guys mentioned that it took him, because he had a whole bunch of external data sources, like 2 minutes for that process to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an option that will allow you to delay the data source validation until you either until you basically when you right. I'm going to give you an option that says when you right click, it'll give you an option for validate the data source if it's not already valid. And what'll happen is that this field, instead of being green or red, if it's not a valid data source, it'll show up as being red. It'll just be white initially. So I'll add an option for that, and then I'll give you a shortcut menu which would allow you to update the data source or to validate the data source. The saved connections feature that I showed you is new. It's as in like a week old, and there are a couple of things that I want to do with that will help. The saved connections. I'm actually saving user IDs and passwords if you want to. That's an option in the system, but I'm saving those in the database separate from the actual tables. So what I want to do is I'm going to modify it so that when you're checking the data sources, if they don't have the connection strings, the full connection strings, I'm going to check in the saved connections and see if that connection is there, and if so, I'll use either the user ID and password that are saved to test the connection and see if it's valid or not. It may be that the server's down. That's really the only reason that might not be valid, would be if the server is down at the moment, or you don't have or your internet connection is down or whatever. So it'll do that. The other thing is that because I'm saving my connections in a local table in the link table manager, I've got an issue of when I bring a new version, I deploy a new version, I'm not going to have those values anymore. I'm going to lose those values. So I'm looking at ideas for how to do that, whether I put those in the registry, or in a text file that allow the user to identify where they want to put that text file. And if I do either of those things, I'll probably add encryption to it so that those user ID and passwords are encrypted. I'll probably do that anyway, even if the user selects to continue to store the data in that local table that's in the link table manager. Another possible change, I've inherited a couple of customers over the last couple of months that are still using Access 2003, and unfortunately, I built the application and used a whole bunch of temp vars variables. So in order to make it backward compatible to 2003, I would need to remove the temp vars and use some other mechanism of storing variables. And I will probably do that because these clients aren't giving me any indication that they're ready to move off at 2003, despite my urging. Let's see here. I kind of already talked about the right-click options for the data source of checking the validity. I also want to be able to refresh the list of tables that are in a data source, and that will also be a right-click thing. Because right now, what happens is if the data source is there, it goes out and looks to see what the tables are. Otherwise, when you click on the available, actually, when you click on available, this is going to be the access ones, but it actually goes out and gets the new ones that are there, that are available that aren't already in the database, but I'm looking at that as well as an option as well. And then I'd like to expand it to other data sources. I don't use any other external data. I don't use any other databases. I'm not using MySQL or Oracle or any of the others. I've got a separate application that does Excel, which allows you to link to basically any open instance of Excel, and that's one of the things that is a real challenge in Access is if you want to link to, if you've got multiple instances of Excel open, and I don't mean multiple Excel spreadsheets open in a single instance, I mean multiple instances of Excel, you can only actually get to one of those instances using the get object method. Otherwise, you have to go through a convoluted process of looking at all of the open windows and getting the handles of those and determining whether it's Excel or not. But I'd like to bring that code into here as well, so that you can link Excel stuff into your applications from this as well. The other problem with Excel, as most of you know, is that if you try to link to Excel, Access automatically thinks it knows what the column types should be, and this other application I have allows you to override that when you do the import of data from Excel. So I'd like to bring that in here as well. I think that's all I have for today, Maria. Does anybody else have any questions?
Okay, and looks like we maybe have, Greg says he's looking forward to this. It looks very interesting here, like a great tool.
I appreciate any, if you see something that's not working right, please let me know. And if you have any ideas of, ways to make it better, I accept those as well.
Okay, great. So to answer the question about pass-through queries, I do not believe it's possible right now to use the Access Teams version of the new link table manager to get to a pass-through query. So that's a good suggestion, though. I will see if I can make that suggestion on user voice and maybe share a link to that on the blog so people can vote for that if they would like to, because I know they are taking, I want lists with regards to that for future improvements. So. Also, I don't want to let our time get away from us today without talking about next month's session. We have on the talk here today the gentleman who is going to speak next month, and that's Jim Detman. And Jim is the president and owner of Online Computer Services of West New York, I think, WNY Inc. They provide custom software development and support services. And next month, Jim is going to talk on advanced techniques on the Access Report Engine. So that should also be a very interesting topic. So please make a note of the last Tuesday of next month to join us. That will be like the day after Memorial Day, which is always a little bit tricky, but again, we will also record the session. Unless there are any other questions, we can end a couple minutes early, and I really want to thank you, Dale, for your very informative presentation today, and I'm sure that a lot of us that do not have the latest and greatest Office 365 could benefit from this tool, which works with the other versions of Access.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Until next time, everybody.